Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your sources and unlock the insights within. Today, you've brought us, well, quite a stack of material on one of the most perplexing cold cases in American history, the death of JonBenét Ramsey.
It really is. A case that, even now, decades later, just keeps sparking intense debate. So many unanswered questions. And your sources, they really highlight the layers of complexity here.
Absolutely. So our mission today, and we're drawing only from the material you've provided, is to kind of weave together the narrative of what happened, really dig into those key inconsistencies that have fueled theories for years, and then explore how modern analytical tools, things like advanced DNA techniques and AI, might offer some fresh perspectives on this enduring mystery.
Yeah, looking at how new technology could potentially revisit the evidence, maybe even recontextualize things that were collected all those years ago.
Okay, let's unpack this then. It starts December 26, 1996, Boulder, Colorado. JonBenét Ramsey, she's 6 years old, reported missing from her home.
And the initial report, according to your sources, it came from Patsy Ramsey. She said she found a handwritten ransom note, found it on the kitchen staircase that morning.
And that's one of the first really striking details, isn't it? A ransom note inside the home, not delivered later. Police did an initial search, but they didn't find JonBenét right away.
No, it was later that same day that her father, John Ramsey, he's the one who finds her body down in the basement.
And this detail, the body being found by the father in the house where the note was also found, investigators immediately flagged that as, well, highly unusual for a typical kidnapping scenario.
Definitely.
Let's dive into that ransom note because your sources give us a lot here. It was long, 2.5 pages, handwritten.
And crucially, written using a pen and notepad found right there in the Ramsey house.
The demand, $118,000.
Right. And John Ramsey pointed out pretty early on, apparently, that this amount was almost exactly his Christmas bonus from the year before.
Which suggested, to some investigators at least, a level of insider knowledge. It even led them to consider employees at John's company, Access Graphics, at one point.
Yeah, that detail really stands out.
The note itself, it had some really peculiar characteristics based on the material you shared. I mean, besides being unusually long, the FBI thought that was very strange for a note left at a crime scene. It apparently only had Patsy's fingerprints on it and fingerprints from the authorities who handled it later.
And it used exclamation marks in an odd way, apparently. And these initialisms, like SBTC, your source mentions it but doesn't define it, which just adds another layer of weirdness.
And the language. Sources point out it seems to echo dialogue from movies. Ruthless people, ransom, speed.
Yeah. That's a bizarre detail. And one source you provided really goes deep into a linguistic analysis of the note. It's fascinating stuff.
What does it say?
Well, it highlights how the author addresses Mr. Ramsey specifically, suggesting the target wasn't random,
Right.
And the note uses this kind of distancing language. Phrases like, we are a group of individuals, a small foreign faction, using we a lot, especially when talking about your daughter. The analysis suggests the author's trying to, create distance.
Separate themselves psychologically from the act.
Exactly. And there's inconsistent spelling business, possession, alongside some fairly complex vocabulary, maybe an attempt to mislead about who wrote it, their education level, perhaps.
But then it also points to language similar to Patsy Ramsey's own writing style, even mentioning the year 1997 twice in the note, just like she apparently did in a Christmas letter.
Right. And from a sort of sociolinguistic view, phrases like, I advise you to be arrested, are seen as potentially suggesting a kind of politeness, maybe more commonly used by women. This analysis leans towards the author likely being female. And the passive voice used for the really gruesome bits, like daughter being beheaded. Again, seen as potentially distancing the writer from the violence itself.
And the insider knowledge thing comes up again in this analysis, too, referencing John by name, mentioning an attaché case, brown paper bags, that specific money amount, even the phrase good Southern common sense.
So based on all these linguistic patterns and details, this particular source concludes that the choices clearly point to Patsy Ramsey as the author, suggesting the note was part of an attempt to cover up family involvement.
Okay, but now it's absolutely crucial we bring in the counterpoint from your other sources.
Yes.
Because one notes that a federal court actually ruled it highly unlikely. Patsy wrote the note. They cited 6 certified handwriting experts, and they specifically criticized what they called uncredentialed, self-proclaimed experts.
And this just perfectly highlights one of the core problems with this case, doesn't it?
Yeah.
When even something as fundamental as who wrote the ransom note leads to completely opposite conclusions from different sets of experts.
Uh-huh.
How do you even begin? It shows just how complex interpreting evidence can be. So much subjectivity.
Exactly. So, moving into the investigation itself, your sources detail that the Boulder police, their initial focus was primarily on the family, the family member theory.
And the rationale cited, well, it makes sense from a statistical angle. An FBI profiler, mentioned in one source, said that statistically, child homicides involve family or caregivers with something like a 12-to-1 probability.
And the police saw no clear evidence of forced entry, but they did see things they interpreted as staging, the note being left inside, the way the body was positioned. And the Ramseys, their initial reluctance to talk to police without lawyers present is also noted. They later said they were afraid of being, railroaded, targeted immediately.
But the intruder theory wasn't without evidence either. There was that unidentified boot print found in the basement room near the body. And this split in interpretation had caused huge conflict within the investigation team.
Yeah, two lead detectives famously clashed over it. Detective Lou Smith, he believed the evidence pointed away from the family, towards an intruder. He actually resigned because he felt that angle wasn't being pursued properly.
And then you had Detective Steve Thomas on the other side. He was convinced the family was involved. And he resigned too, but he cited interference from the district attorney's office, believing it hindered his investigation into the family theory.
So this internal disagreement, it definitely didn't help clear things up.
Not at all.
Now, a grand jury was convened in 1999, and your sources say they recommended charges against the Ramseys. Something related to child abuse resulting in death and hindering prosecution.
Right, but the district attorney at the time, Alex Hunter, he decided not to prosecute. He stated there just wasn't enough evidence to meet that very high standard of beyond a reasonable doubt needed for a criminal conviction.
And the sources note the statute of limitations on the specific grand jury charges later expired. It's also mentioned that Burke Ramsey, he was 9 at the time, was publicly cleared by both police and the DA back in 1999.
So, after all that, the initial investigation, the grand jury, the case remained unsolved. And this left this huge public debate fueled by so many lingering questions.
Which brings us to the inconsistencies. Your sources, especially some of the commentary pieces, they detail a really striking number of inconsistencies in the Ramseys' accounts, statements about that night, the days after.
Yeah.
And it's important, I think, to frame these not necessarily as proof of lying, but as details that investigators and many others just found really difficult to square with the known facts or with other accounts. They remain major points of contention.
Absolutely. These inconsistencies are where the puzzle pieces just seem to refuse to fit for so many people looking at this case. Let's maybe look at some key areas. First, details around JonBenét getting home that night and what happened right after.
Okay, so you've got conflicting accounts from John Ramsey himself about how she got inside. Did he read to her, or did he carry her in already asleep?
And then the related question, how did she get into her pajamas if she stayed asleep the whole time?
Right. And Burke's story about that night also seems to shift. Initially, he reportedly went straight to sleep. But later, he said on Dr. Phil's show that he actually snuck downstairs to play with a toy.
Even a seemingly minor point, like who checked on Burke that morning. Patsy reportedly claimed John did it, but Burke apparently said it was Patsy, calling her Psycho Patsy, according to one source. These might seem small, but investigators rely on these details to build a reliable timeline.
Exactly. Small discrepancies in core events like that, they can raise questions about the whole narrative being presented. Then you have inconsistencies about objects, things in the house.
A big one revolves around those pry marks on an exterior screen door. Patsy apparently claims she never noticed them. But one source says a family friend knew they were there, knew Patsy knew, and that they were basically from John, sometimes having to break in when he forgot his keys.
And that friend apparently cut ties after the Ramseys used a photo of that same door damage in a newspaper ad, trying to suggest it was the intruder's entry point.
Wow. Yeah, that's quite a detail. It shows how these inconsistencies are perceived. Another one that raised eyebrows was about JonBenét's underwear.
Oh, yeah, the oversized ones.
Right. Patsy insisted she'd put this oversized pair, size 12-14, in a drawer for her niece. But somehow JonBenét ended up wearing them, even though she normally wore size 46. And the rest of that specific package of underwear was apparently missing.
Weird.
There are also conflicting accounts noted about Burke's stuff. The Ramseys reportedly denied he owned high-tech boots, but apparently he did. And Patsy claims she was the one who tore wrapping paper on presents down in the basement.
But a source indicates Burke actually did that, playing on Christmas Day.
Exactly. And when you have an unidentified boot print near the body, conflicting accounts about boots suddenly become more significant.
Yeah, definitely. And John's changing story about breaking that basement window months earlier. First saying he was looking for glass shards after finding the body, then later saying he knew there was no glass because he'd broken it previously and cleaned it up. These are specific, verifiable points where the story changed.
And moving to inconsistencies in just statements and behavior. This covers a lot. John reportedly arranging a flight on his private plane to Atlanta just 30 minutes after finding JonBenét's body.
Yeah, that's jarring.
And the reason changed. First, it was for a meeting he can't miss. Later, it was visiting family. Atlanta was where his legal and PR people were based. Their original plan was Michigan for a second Christmas. So the urgency, the changing reason, flagged as concerning by some sources.
And the 911 call itself. The operator reported Patsy stopped talking, but she heard other voices in the room before the call ended.
Which contradicts the Ramseys' later statements that Burke was asleep and they were the only ones awake and involved in that call.
Their decision to fly out of state pretty quickly after the murder instead of sticking around for more police questioning, that's also noted as, well, unusual behavior.
For parents whose child was just found murdered in their home.
Yeah. And the observation from some sources that the Ramseys often express sympathy for the killer in interviews rather than, anger or a desire for vengeance, some investigators found that atypical.
One source brings up John's past extramarital affair. Not as direct evidence, obviously, but as potentially showing a capacity for secrets and deception that contrasted with his public image. And it notes inconsistencies in how he and Patsy talked about that affair later as being weird. It's about character analysis, I suppose.
And finally, inconsistencies about the Christmas party the night before. Did JonBenét and Burke go inside the Steins' house when they dropped off presents? Or stay asleep in the car?
An interview with Susan Stein, the host, suggested the kids did come inside and that JonBenét was actually bubbly, which again, it impacts the timeline the kids state just hours before everything supposedly happened.
It's clear from the sheer volume and the nature of these inconsistencies, as laid out in your sources, why this case is still so hotly debated, why it fuels such different theories. There's just so much room for interpretation.
Absolutely. Are they signs of trauma, stress, faulty memory under pressure, or something else? That's the core question these inconsistencies raise.
Which makes the idea of applying modern analytical techniques potentially so interesting. Let's maybe transition now to how forensic science and tools like AI have moved on since 1996 and what that could mean if applied here.
Right, let's start with the DNA evidence found back then. We know traces of male DNA were reportedly found on the cord used and on the paintbrush handle used as a garrote.
And according to one investigator cited, A. James Culler, there were specifically 6 separate DNA samples from unknown individuals found in relation to the crime scene evidence.
But at the time, even that DNA was heavily debated. Some saw it as clear proof of an unknown killer, an intruder. Others, like the forensic pathologist Michael Baden, argued that trace DNA is everywhere. It can be transferred innocently.
Meaning it could end up on something without the person ever being directly involved in the crime, like secondary transfer.
Exactly. Maybe they touched something someone else touched later. So its presence didn't automatically mean stranger involvement to everyone, a critical sticking point.
But your scientific source really details how much forensic DNA analysis has leaped forward since '96. Traditional methods, like STR profiling, they had limitations, especially with tiny or degraded samples.
But now we have newer techniques. Massively parallel sequencing MPS, or sometimes called next-generation sequencing, NGS. This can analyze DNA even when the amounts are minuscule or the sample is old and broken down. It gives much more detailed profiles.
And probabilistic genotyping, that sounds complex.
It is, but essentially it uses specialized software to interpret really complex DNA mixtures. Samples that have DNA from multiple people mixed together, which used to be almost impossible to sort out, this software can potentially tease apart the different profiles.
And forensic DNA phenotyping is also advancing.
Yeah, though your source notes there are ethical and legal hurdles here. But it can potentially predict things about the DNA donor's appearance, like their ancestry, maybe eye or hair color, just from the DNA sample itself. Intelligence gathering, basically.
And the big one everyone hears about now, Forensic genetic genealogy.
Right. Using those large consumer DNA databases like GED Match to find distant relatives of an unknown person's DNA. That's the technique that famously cracked the Golden State Killer case and others.
So, based on your source, the obvious question is, how could these modern techniques be applied to the DNA in the JonBenét case today? Could MPS get better, more complete profiles from those trace samples on the cord and paintbrush?
Could probabilistic genotyping maybe make sense of those 6 unknown samples Kohler mentioned? Potentially separate out individuals if it's a mixture.
And the really big question, could genetic genealogy, assuming the DNA profiles are suitable, possibly identify distant relatives of any of those unknown DNA donors, potentially pointing investigators in a completely new direction?
These are all potential avenues, obviously not guaranteed solutions, but they represent powerful tools that just weren't available back then. A whole new lens.
Okay, now let's look at AI. How could artificial intelligence potentially play a role in a complex cold case like this, based on your final source? It highlights AI's perfect recall, its ability to spot patterns humans might miss in huge amounts of data.
Yeah, AI can flag key passages in documents, cross-reference information across, thousands of pages of interview transcripts, police reports, evidence logs,
Yeah.
tracking how details connect or contradict each other. It could massively speed up the process of reviewing all this material.
The source also suggests AI could help fight confirmation bias, right? By offering an impartial analysis, highlighting points that challenge both the family theory and the intruder theory, perhaps.
Potentially, yes. By just looking at the data patterns. So how could AI actually be applied here? Imagine feeding the entire case file, every interview, every report, the ransom note analyses, witness statements, evidence logs, even old investigative summaries into an AI system.
Could it spot subtle patterns or contradictions across all those inconsistent statements we talked about? Connections that maybe got lost in the sheer volume of paper over the decades.
Could it cross-reference every single mention of, say, the basement window or the pineapple or the flashlight or the stun gun theory, and instantly flag every discrepancy across every account in a way no human could ever do manually?
It's that potential to connect the dots across this massive, messy data set that makes AI seem like such an interesting possibility for a case this complex and old.
But the source is very clear. AI is an assistance tool. It needs responsible oversight. It needs human critical thinking. You have to watch for biases in the AI itself. It's not a magic bullet replacing investigators, but maybe a very powerful aid.
Leveraging technology to manage the complexity, basically, and maybe see things that were missed. So, where does this leave us? What does it all mean? After almost 30 years, the JonBenét Ramsey case is still just this incredibly complex puzzle. You've got the bizarre ransom note, the conflicting theories about what happened, and as your sources really laid out, just a striking number of inconsistencies surrounding the key events.
Yeah, you've shown us through this material just how incredibly challenging that initial investigation was. Conflicting evidence, internal disagreements, leaving so many basic questions about December 26, 1996, still unanswered.
But you've also highlighted these incredible advancements since then, in forensic science, in artificial intelligence.
Which really does raise a fascinating question, doesn't it? Could revisiting that physical evidence with today's powerful DNA techniques and analyzing that vast, complicated ocean of statements and reports with the impartial pattern-finding power of AI, could that finally bring some clarity? Could it help make sense of those enduring inconsistencies? And maybe, just maybe, reveal what really happened that night?
Thank you for taking this deep dive with us. We hope it gives you, perhaps, a new perspective on this truly enduring mystery.